I'm Lorraine. Standing in that cold Massachusetts courtroom, I could feel the weight of years of pent-up emotion. The air was thick with perfume and tension as I pushed open the doors. My mother, seated in the front row with immaculate hair and softly pink-painted lips, rolled her eyes the moment she saw me, as if victory was already hers. But then, the judge, Judge Thompson, looked up. His face went blank for a second, and then recognition dawned. "Wait, the charges are against you," he blurted out before regaining his composure. The courtroom fell silent. My parents, Amy and Ryan Thompson, stared at him, utterly confused. Little did they know who I really was and what I'd been waiting to do for so long. Let me take you back. I grew up in a world where love was a scarce commodity. My parents, Amy and Ryan, were high-flying corporate executives in New York City, while I was left in the care of my grandparents in a small town in Vermont. They were the kind of people who were always too busy for me. Instead of warm hugs and bedtime stories, I got impersonal emails and the occasional expensive gift. When I was just 4 months old, my parents left me with my grandparents for what they said was a short business trip. That short trip turned into my entire childhood. My earliest memories are of my grandmother, Rose, in the kitchen. The smell of freshly baked apple pies filled the air, and the sound of her gentle humming as she kneaded the dough was like a lullaby. She was my rock, always there with a kind word and a warm smile. She never made me feel like a burden. To her, I was the most precious thing in the world. My grandfather, Judge Henry Thompson, was a man of integrity and wisdom. Every evening, he'd come home from the courthouse, still in his robe, and ask me about my day. I'd show him my drawings, and he'd examine them with the same seriousness he gave to his legal cases. I naively thought that all families were like mine until I started school. Other kids had their parents cheering them on at sports events and school plays. I had 2 empty seats, but my grandmother made up for it by clapping twice as loud. When I asked her why my parents didn't come, she'd say, "They're working hard to give you a good life, dear." I wanted to believe her, but even at 8, I could sense the growing distance between us. The few times my parents did visit, it was a farce. Amy would arrive in designer clothes, barely giving me a glance, and spend the whole time on her phone. Ryan would be impatient, constantly checking his watch. I quickly learned that their version of family was all about appearances. Grandpa used to say, "Justice isn't about getting even, Lorraine. It's about standing up for what's right." And he lived by those words. He was there for every important moment in my life, from my first tooth to my high school graduation. When other kids talked about their family's wealth and inheritance, I thought about the love and guidance he gave me. The first major crack in my family came when I was 20. I'd driven home from college to surprise my grandmother. I found her in the garden, planting daffodil bulbs. "Spring is always worth the wait," she said with a smile. But later that day, she had a sudden heart attack and passed away. My grandfather was devastated. I found him sitting in the garden, holding her gardening gloves, whispering her name. We buried her 3 days later. My parents showed up late, left before the reception, and never called after that. That was the day I stopped making excuses for them. After that, my grandfather and I grew even closer. Sundays became our special time. We'd cook together, talk about law, and discuss the importance of truth. He taught me that the law could strip away the false facades people put up. Years went by. I graduated from law school and became a prosecutor. My grandfather watched my every achievement with quiet pride. My parents, on the other hand, sent a short text message saying, "Good job." That was their idea of showing love. Then, at 90, my grandfather passed away in his sleep. The house felt so empty without him. At the reading of his will, I expected maybe a few of his books or a keepsake. Instead, the lawyer handed me everything: the family house, his savings, and investments worth over $3,500,000, along with a sealed letter addressed only to me. The letter said, "You earned this through your love and presence, not by blood." I held that letter so tightly my hands shook. It was a validation of all the love and support I'd given him. But then, the storm hit. 30 days later, my colleague and friend, Jake, called me from his office. His voice was cautious. "They filed, Lorraine." "Filed what?" I asked. "Your parents. They're suing you, claiming undue influence." I laughed at first. They thought I'd manipulated my grandfather for his money. But then, the realization hit me, and a sharp pain shot through my throat. Of course, they would do this. That night, I drove to the family house and unlocked my grandfather's study. I found a folder labeled payments. Inside were decades of records of monthly transfers to my parents, along with notes he'd written every time they asked for more money. Amy needed a new car, Ryan's business was failing again. Page after page, it added up to over $900,000. He'd known this day might come and had prepared me for it. I sat in the dark, looking at the papers, and whispered, "You saw them clearly, didn't you, Grandpa?" The anger burned inside me, cold and steady. They wanted to drag me into court? Fine. They were about to face the woman they'd helped create. Jake warned me that the lawsuit would be ugly, but he had no idea how far my parents would go. Within a week, headlines started appearing in local papers, "Daughter accused of manipulating retired judge." I could feel the whispers in the courthouse halls. Colleagues who once respected me now avoided my gaze. One night, sitting alone in my office, the only light coming from my desk lamp, I looked at the scanned filings on my screen. Lies dressed up as grief. They painted me as a heartless predator. For a moment, I almost believed their version of me. That's the power of family, they can make you doubt yourself. But then, I reached for the box I'd brought from my grandfather's house. Inside were all the records, the bills, and the messages he'd kept. Each page was a confession of their neglect. I spread them across the floor, and as I did, my pulse slowed. The chaos in my chest turned into a cold determination. When Jake came to my office the next morning, he found me sitting on the floor surrounded by stacks of evidence. "I guess we're going to war," I said quietly. He looked at me and then at the papers. "You really want to do this?" "I don't want to," I replied, "but they do. I'm just giving them what they asked for." Over the next week, we built our case. We gathered witnesses, created timelines, and compiled copies of every transfer. We had my grandfather's handwritten notes, his emails, and his medical check-ups that proved he was of sound mind until the end. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, the kind my grandfather had taught me to believe in. The nights were the hardest. A part of me, the daughter part, still hoped they'd stop, apologize, and remember that I was their child. But that hope had died a long time ago, between the missed birthdays and the forgotten graduations. As the trial date approached, my fear turned into resolve. They wanted to face me in court, but they didn't realize they were walking into my grandfather's courtroom, in a way. On the morning of the hearing, Boston was covered in sleet. The streets glistened like shattered glass, and my reflection in the courthouse window looked like a stranger. Inside the courtroom, the marble floor echoed with my every step. I could feel the eyes on me and the whispers. "That's her, the granddaughter being sued." When the trial began, their attorney, Mr. Harris, stood up. He had a smooth voice and theatrical gestures, trying to charm the judge. "Your Honor, this is a tragedy. A devoted daughter has been unjustly cut out of her father's will by a manipulative granddaughter," he said, gesturing towards my mother. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, as if she were truly heartbroken. Mr. Harris continued, "In his final years, Judge Thompson was vulnerable and isolated. My client, Mrs. Thompson, was denied the chance to reconcile with her father, and his estate was wrongly diverted." I sat there, hands clasped, listening. I'd faced liars in court before, and I could smell the fabrication. When Mr. Harris finished, Jake stood up. He was calm and authoritative. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Judge Henry Thompson was of sound mind and made his decisions deliberately. It will also show that the plaintiffs, Mrs. and Mr. Thompson, received over $900,000 from him over 20 years while visiting him less than once a year. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. My mother's painted calm cracked slightly. Mr. Harris called my mother to the stand first. She adjusted her blazer and began, "He was everything to me. I loved my father dearly. We spoke often, but after my mother died, he withdrew from everyone." Jake cross-examined her. Mrs. Thompson, according to your father's calendar, you visited 4 times in your daughter's first year of life, Christmas, Easter, her birthday, and 1 Saturday in July. Is that correct? She pressed her lips together. I was young, and I don't remember exact numbers. Jake lifted the folder of payments. Your father documented each visit alongside monthly transfers to you and Mr. Thompson. Over $900,000 in total. Can you explain why someone being manipulated would continue to make voluntary payments for 2 decades? Her voice cracked. He wanted to help. Jake leaned in. He did, but only financially. Emotionally, you were absent. Physically, too. When was the last time you saw your father before his death? She was silent for a moment, then glanced at my father, who looked away. 3 years before he died. Jake continued, at his 87th birthday. You were there for 90 minutes, no cake, no photos. Is that correct? She swallowed. Yes. Jake paused. So, the man you claim to have loved dearly died believing you were too busy to visit, yet now you stand here claiming his fortune was rightfully yours. Mr. Harris objected, argumentative. The judge sustained the objection, but his eyes were fixed on my mother. Then it was my father's turn. He took the stand, his hands shaking. Jake asked him, Mr. Thompson, did you attend your daughter's high school graduation and college? He hesitated. We were out of town. Jake projected a photo on the screen of my college graduation, with my grandfather in the front row, clapping. You weren't there, but he was, Jake said. I stared at the photo, my throat tightening, not from pain but from pride. Mr. Harris made one last attempt. Your Honor, grief clouds judgment. My clients loved their father. They were victims of manipulation. The judge nodded. Let's hear from the defendant. I stood up. The sound of my heels on the floor echoed like a countdown. I raised my right hand, took the oath, and sat down. Jake asked me, Miss Thompson, can you tell the court about your relationship with your grandfather? I looked directly at my mother. He raised me. He taught me to tell the truth, even when it was hard. Mr. Harris interrupted, isn't it true you benefited financially from that relationship? Yes, I said. But not in the way you think. He gave me something money can't buy, love, consistency, and a sense of family. He showed up when you didn't. Did you encourage him to cut his daughter out of the will? I met his eyes. If I wanted inheritance, I could have spent my time networking instead of having dinner with an old man. But I wasn't after the money. I was after the only family I had left. The room fell silent. Mr. Harris had no comeback. Jake handed the judge the sealed letter my grandfather had left me. The judge read it silently, his face softening. He looked up. This letter alone speaks volumes. He turned to my parents. The court finds that Judge Thompson's will reflects his true and deliberate intentions. There is no evidence of manipulation, no sign of incompetence. The plaintiff's claim is without merit. The gavel struck. Case dismissed. Legal fees awarded to the defendant. My mother gasped, and my father slumped in his chair. As the room emptied, my mother approached me, her voice trembling. Lorraine, please. Can we talk? I looked at her, the woman who'd abandoned me. Talk about what? You're the woman who gave birth to me. My mother was Rose Thompson. Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt nothing but clarity. I turned to leave, but paused at the door. They never knew who I really was, I whispered. Outside, the cold air hit my face. I walked down the courthouse steps, my heels clicking. Reporters were waiting, but I walked straight through them. No statements, no victory speech. Just the sound of my heels cutting through the noise. Back in my car, I finally exhaled. For the first time, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. My grandfather was right, justice may be slow, but it always arrives on time. The weeks after the trial were quiet. My parents disappeared from my life. No calls, no apologies. Just the silence they were so good at. But this time, it didn't hurt. 3 years later, I stood behind the bench my grandfather once presided over, wearing his robe. Judge Lorraine Thompson, the youngest in Massachusetts history. On my first day, I touched the wooden gavel he'd left me and whispered, "We made it, Grandpa." Years passed. Promotions came, and so did peace. At 60, I retired. My last visit was to the cemetery where my grandparents were buried. Daffodils were blooming around their headstones. I knelt down and planted a few new bulbs. "You were right," I said softly. "Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up." As the wind blew through the trees, I could almost hear my grandfather's laugh, steady, proud, and free. I learned that lesson too late to save my parents, but just in time to save myself. If you've ever had to stand up to people who were supposed to love you, tell me your story below. And don't forget to subscribe. More truths are coming.